Hey night travelers, tonight we're tossing out the sepia-toned photos of cherubic children in lace collars and stepping into the strict, suffocating, and occasionally downright dangerous world of Victorian parenting. Forget gentle bedtime stories and Montessori playrooms. You're about to spend the day in a household where obedience is law, emotions are a weakness, and discipline would land you in court today. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1885. The good news, children are considered the pride and future of the family. The bad news, they're also expected to be miniature adults seen but not heard and preferably working by the age of 10. The first thing you notice is the stiffness in the air, in the rules, and in the starched collars digging into your neck. Your nursery is less pastel and plush toys, more a cold upstairs room with iron bedsteads, scratchy wool blankets, and a governess who could double as a prison warden. Breakfast isn't pancakes and juice, it's porridge, eaten silently under the watchful eye of a parent or servant. Smiling too much? Suspicious. Asking questions? Borderline rebellious. The good news, you're getting an education, reading, arithmetic, moral instruction. The bad news, it comes with canings, ear-twisting, and public humiliation for mistakes. Love is expressed through strict order and withheld affection, because coddling is believed to spoil the child. Outside, the air smells faintly of coal smoke and damp wool, while inside the home, every clock chimes the passing of another rigidly scheduled hour. And by the time you've survived lessons, etiquette drills, and the occasional moral correction, you'll be ready to trade your pinafore for parole papers. You come up from a sleep that is more thaw than rest. Your breath fogs in front of your face and the air bites wherever skin shows. Knuckles, the slope of your nose, the thin corner of ear the nightcap missed. The room smells of damp wool and a faint, lingering tang of urine that precise hands have failed to scrub away this morning. Frost filigrees the little pane of glass, etching tiny fern patterns against a gray sky. When you press your forehead to the cold, the glass stings and the pattern blurs into your reflection. Eyes half closed, cheeks pinked by the cold hair matted with the imprint of a tightly tied ribbon. The bed frame is a black iron thing that clicks when you shift. The mattress is packed with straw. It sighs under you and scratches through the cheap ticking. The blanket that covers you is heavy and coarse. Cambric lining gone stiff with repeated steaming, the outer weave like rope against your skin. You try to tuck it higher, but the corners refuse to cooperate. There is no mattress pad to soften the lumps. The pillow is a folded handkerchief. You count the springs, not because they interest you, but because counting keeps your thoughts from wandering into trouble. A chipped basin sits on a wooden stand at the foot of the bed, the remainder of last night's water still misting the air with a warm, iron smell. A flicker of oil from the night lamp outlines the dark knot of wood in the corner, and the silhouette of a wardrobe swollen with damp. Its door has been left ajar, and inside hang the day's clothes. A stiff-smelling pinafore, a vest with flaking buttons, a collar starched to such a cusp that it would slice a thumb. Each piece holds the ghost of yesterday, porridge splatters, a small patch of jam, evidence of other small, permissible sins. There is a ticking somewhere, a small, deliberate metronome of discipline, a cheap clock wound by the housemaid, perhaps, its plaintive tick matching your racing pulse. Time in this room is a succession of ordered cruelties. Get up, wash, dress, sit, stand, repeat. The window has been left cracked despite the frost. A draft tracks along the floorboards like a whisper. When you place your toes on the boards, you recoil. The cold climbs through your stockings, making your toes ache as if they have forgotten how to be warm. You are not alone for long. A soft footfall approaches. The nursery maid, breathless and shaped by the law of efficiency. She is lugging a basin on one hip and a dripping kettle in the other hand, steam curling off her sleeve. Her face is composed of fatigue and sharpened acceptance. She says nothing, but lays out a coarse towel with ritual care. Her hands move quickly, folding, smoothing, patting. She has a routine that will rob you of the remaining sleep in your limbs. She tips the kettle and the water is almost too hot to touch. You grimace, letting her scrub the night's crust from your face. The water smells of coal and old soap. She fusses with the laces at the back of your dress, pulls, tugs, her expression softening for half a second before the sour line of duty returns. In the corner, a small boy, your brother, is peering at you from under a blanket like a conspirator. He has smeared ink across his forehead from last night's mischief and is trying, flummoxed, to wipe it away without getting noticed. He snuffles, then tries to make a face, an attempt at bravery, and one of his teeth gleams with a candy sugar still clinging to the gum line. A rap on the nursery door startles him. He drops the candle he was hiding behind the wardrobe. The flame gutters out with a wet cough. You exchange looks, a miniature pact of complicity, and then the maid shoots you both a look that curdles fancy into fear. The boy pretends he was ill, that he was never intending to play with fire, and you decide quickly that you will shoulder his deception. There's a short, sharp scolding later, a punishment doled out with a slipper that thwaps the air the way thunder thwaps the sky. It is quick, it is efficient. It is remembered in the way an animal remembers. A trainer's hand. On the shelf, a tin of peppermint lozenges rattles when you move. Someone, perhaps yesterday, perhaps an afternoon that belonged to no one, has left a scrap of newspaper folded into a crude airplane. It bears an advertisement for patent medicines promising rosy cheeks and firm digestion, their promises as thin as the paper they print on. You take a lozenge and find it bitter, with a sting that wakes your gums. You suck it with a guilty smile, knowing such tiny pleasures are measured and taxed. A noise from down the narrow staircase, muffled voices, a clink of china, tells you breakfast is nearly ready. The sound brings a brief pang of comfort. Food, even if it is porridge or stale bread, is a warmth that might reach into the cold and press it back. Yet even that simple, honest hunger is policed here. You have learned to sit with your hands folded, to tilt your chin just so, to swallow quiet as if obedience had a flavor. A wooden spoon beats time from the landing below, and the rhythm matches the one in your chest. Someone coughs, a high, nervous sound, and the governess' shadow crosses the landing like a blade. Her footsteps are the kind that stop play mid-breath. She enters without knocking because she never needed permission. Her skirts whisper, her gloves are immaculate. Up close you can see the corner of her mouth pulled into a permanent frown. She stands and surveys the room as if reading a ledger. Her eyes are meticulous instruments, cataloging the angle of the bedclothes, the state of your hair, the cleanliness of the soles of your shoes. She holds a stick made of some honest wood, thin and polished by many hands. You notice it, of course, how could you not? A child's ears are tuned to the language of consequence. You shuffle, make an effort to appear composed. The governess steps forward and hums, not a comforting tune but a counting, a ledger of small expectations. Up, wash, dress, line up on the landing. Her voice is soft enough to soothe, but it is the kind of softness that contains a razor. She mentions lessons for the morning, reading, needlework, and something called moral drill, which smells to you of heavy books and heavier words. You nod because nodding is currency here. A mouse passes the baseboard, hairless, urgent, bold, and you watch it go, half hopeful that mischief might follow. It is gone before your hands can move. Outside, the frost seems to deepen. Inside, every small movement carves heat or consequence. You pull the blanket tighter and imagine the warming pan you will press into the bed later. A small, secret bounty your grandmother smuggled you last Christmastide. You imagine the weight of it across your feet like an ally. For a moment your thoughts wander to a future where beds are feathered and rooms smell of lavender and steam. Not because it is likely, but because hope is a habit no amount of discipline can fully break. The nursery holds its breath, and so do you. The day is about to begin, and the world of measured steps and measured words awaits beyond that frosted glass. You wake to the metallic scrape of a wardrobe door and the soft, relentless ticking of a mantel clock. The light is leaden, silver through soot-stained glass. A maid is already at your bed, fingers brisk and practical, pulling aside coarse wool and replacing it with something that looks better suited to armor than to sleep. A bodice, a pinafore, layers of linen that have been starched until they stand away from the skin like the brim of a hat. The weave is fine, but the treatment makes it unforgiving. You breathe. The fabric answers with a dry whisper. The dressing room smells of damp cotton, boiled starch, and a faint medicinal scent the governess wears like perfume, camphor, or perhaps a dab of eau de cologne to mask long days. The governess is there before you fully understand where you are. Tall, iron-chinned, spectacles halfway down her nose. Her gloves are inexplicably immaculate. She does not smile. She has the habit of moving her hands as if she is arranging invisible objects, smoothing imaginary hems, correcting phantom faults. You are the object tonight. She directs you into a stiff, boned bodice. Hands hers, perhaps the maid's, move with clinical efficiency, tugging laces through eyelets, pulling them so tight you taste iron at the back of your throat. Straighten, she says, and you do. Your shoulders are pinned into a posture that feels unnatural, and yet is praised as moral. You inhale the smell of starch as someone opens a tin and dabs a damp cloth into it, then presses fabric until it becomes a crisp plane. The starch itself is a substance that commands respect. Rice, potato, maybe wheat, boiled down into a white paste that, when dried over a hot iron, turns anything into a shield. The hot iron hisses like a small, compliant serpent. The governess takes it with the devotion of a priest tending a relic. It is heavier than you expect. She drags it across a collar, and a cloud of steam rises, smelling of burnt sugar. For a flicker, a moment that feels like a breath held too long, you watch the iron press a thin brown mark into a sleeve. The maid clucks, red-faced, and apologizes. The governess pinches the fabric with clinical disdain and drags on, as though the scorch is an insult you have personally committed. There is a hierarchy in this room as visible as the buttons on your cuff. The governess's pronouncements are law. The maid obeys. The footman waits by the door with boots that look like they could tramp across cobbles without flinching. You are positioned between these pillars of obedience. When the boots are put on, leather stiff, lined perhaps with horsehair, you have to pry your foot into them against the arch like forcing a fish into a jar. The footman's. Thumbs press, squeezing your ankle to coax the leather, and the sound is private and intimate, the leather protesting, the thump of your toes finding the sole. You can feel each stitch under your heel. The sole is hard. It will leave little bruises the first walk home. She checks the length of your skirt with a measuring tape, the cold metallic strip sliding across starched petticoats. Not below the ankle, she asserts, as if the hemline is also a moral matter. Your skirt hangs like a statement. Every fold is deliberate. The stiffness makes each step a deliberate calculation. You think before you move because the fabric will not obey whim. There are brief, sharp incidents that pop into the morning like pinpricks. A little boy, perhaps a brother, bursts in, cheeks mottled from an early scolding, a button strained at his waist. He tugs at it. It gives with a theatrical pop and flies across the room, landing on the governess's foot. She looks down, counts aloud the loss of restraint, and sends him to fetch a needle. Another time, a nursery toddler wriggles free of a pinafore and comes up slick with porridge. There is an indignant scolding and then, absurdly, a reprimand for making the linen dirty, as if stains were sins. These tiny disruptions are swallowed by the room's stern rhythm. They are acknowledged and then smoothed away like creases. You learn an etiquette of discomfort. The governess demonstrates how to fold your hands without letting your fingers clatter, how to sit so the back of the hand is never visible when tea is poured, how to lower your eyes to suggest humility rather than boredom. She seats you on a straight-backed chair and watches you. You can feel her counting invisible ticks, assessing the angle of your chin. A correction comes not as a question, but as a statement of what you failed to do. Elbow further in, she instructs. You bend, and there is the faint sense of a posture being engineered. Her tools are not only cloth and iron. There is a dictionary open on a small table. Next to it, a ruler rests like a tiny wooden authority. You suspect it has been used for something other than drawing lines. She will use its blunt edge as punctuation to a lecture when words might be interpreted as negotiating. Once in a small and tragic comedy, a brace of gloves is removed from a drawer and a moth quivers out, tapping the window pane in a last, brief panic. The governess stoops to catch it and lets it escape, mercifully trivial in a day of enforced trials. You think of the moth as a tiny blasphemy against the room's sterility. When buttons are fastened, they make a private clack that seems to echo. Each fastened hook is a small victory and a tiny imprisonment. Pins prick the back of your hand when they jab through layers to keep shape. A bright, sharp ache blooms, then dulls. You are not allowed to scratch. The governess watches for that, too. You hold still as if being preserved. There is humor, dark and involuntary. You catch yourself imagining the stiff fabric as armor against the world. If you cannot run, perhaps you will be preserved. If you cannot cry aloud, perhaps the body will remember. The governess teaches you to suppress a laugh with a hand pressed to the mouth, particularly useful when a maid gingerly pats your hair into a shape that looks like a small crown made by a committee with poor taste. Dressing takes time, not merely the mechanics but the ceremony of affirmation. The governess makes you recite the day's duties as she finishes a cuff. Order is ritual. Each pleat is a taught virtue. Each starched fold insists on conformity. This is how discipline is embodied, in the resistance of fabric to the curves of a child's body, in the deliberate constriction of movement, in the daily performance of restraint. When you finally stand, arranged, buttoned, ironed, and footed, you feel like a puppet that someone has put back in a case. The governess takes one more long look, tips the brim of a pin into place, and satisfied steps back. Her expression does not change, but a small sheen of sweat glitters at her temple, a reminder that she too is a worker in a system that rewards control. You step forward to leave, skirt making a soft, crisp sound. The air outside the door is slightly warmer, but the stiffness remains. You walk through the rooms like a promise kept. The most intimate parts of you have been catalogued and corrected, and you have learned to move as if under glass. In a household that values order above all, your clothing is the first sermon. You wear it, and you learn to be quiet, to be neat, and perhaps most of all, to hold your breath until the next time you must be remade. You push open the dining room door and the hush swallows you whole. The room is a tunnel of polished wood and shadow, the long table running like a spine down its center. Morning light slants through smoke-strewn glass and catches on silver spoons, a basin for tea, a sugar bowl, all arranged with the precision of a small regiment. The hearth is just a bank of gray coals now, its last breath of heat rising in thin, oily smoke that smells faintly of burnt oatmeal and damp leather. You draw your coat tighter not because you are cold, exactly, but because everything in here seems designed to compress you. The chairs are narrow, the collars high, the expectations higher. A footman without ceremony sets your bowl down with a muted clunk. The pewter is warm from his hands, the rim rimmed with a thin ring of dried porridge skin. The porridge itself sits like a pale swamp, oatmeal scalded until the edges seamed, and the center has congealed into something. Between porridge and paste. It's lukewarm, too cool to steam, too warm to be pleasant. You lift the spoon and it meets resistance in the bowl. The spoon tastes faintly of copper and the metal sings as it scrapes. You bring a spoonful to your lips and the texture is a compromise. Grainy, a little sandy, finished with a whisper of salt. There is no sugar at your place. The wealthy houses sometimes offer treacle or preserves. Today your breakfast is austere, evidently meant to teach fortitude as much as to nourish. The rule is obvious and absolute. You do not speak unless spoken to. The enforced silence settles over your shoulders like another garment. Eyes drift not in greeting but in calculation. Who is nearest to the mistress? Who has the cleanest hands? Who is likely to commit an audible sin? You chew with your mouth closed, count the seconds between spoonfuls, and watch the faces across the table for any crack in the statuesque calm. The household has its own choreography. The eldest boy sits nearest the head and takes his porridge in measured bites, his jaw working like a metronome. The youngest sits nearer the door so the servants may whisk him away when he becomes boisterous. A governess sits a little apart, her posture a tower of restraint, one gloved hand resting on a book as if knowledge itself were a weapon. The master dips his bread into his tea without looking up. Nobody laughs. Nobody coughs without excusing themselves in a softened tone that is more ritual than apology. A short incident. The toddler, 2 chairs down, has the bad luck to catch a curious fly between his fingers. It buzzes, he claps, and a glob of porridge catapults from his spoon onto the sleeve of the girl opposite him. For a breath, the spoon is suspended midair. The household inhales. The girl keeps her face blank. A footman moves like a shadow, blotting the stain with a damp cloth, muttering nothing. The toddler is sent silently to the guardian's knee, where fingers tighten in place and his face is planted into a linen handkerchief until he learns that excitement at table is a misdemeanor. Another small scene unfolds at the far end. A footman, returning from the scullery, misjudges his path and brushes against a rug. A milk pail wobbles. The master's hand stabs the table not to strike, only to mark displeasure, and the man in the scullery freezes, the music of cups stilled. Milk spills in a thin pale vein along the boards. The footman mops at it with paper, cheeks burning like coals. No one speaks. A maid, eyes downcast, catches the footman's sleeve and murmurs something that looks like consolation. The master does not look up. The world here runs on invisible fines and private shames rather than public recriminations. The porridge presses its character upon you. At first bland, then stubbornly filling the hollows of your hunger, then suddenly alive with the tiny dark flecks of grit that suggest a millstone or a less than careful thrashing. You swallow with the efficiency of someone who has been instructed to make food an act rather than an experience. The spoon clinks against the bowl, a small metallic cry that makes you lower your hand and feel suddenly childlike for making noise. The table is a classroom in miniature. Lessons are administered with the minimal currency of words. A single phrase from the mistress, Edmund, will stop the eldest mid-chew and send a column of explanations marching from his lips. You are not invited to contribute. If you attempt a question, it will be deflected with a look. If you tell a joke, it will be met with the same equivalent of a tax, a cold, the removal of a privilege. The idea is elegant in its economy. Cultivate the habit of obedience, and you will not need to break wills with physical force. There is a second small commotion. A cousin at the table smirks at some private memory, and a muffled chuckle threatens to slip out. The governess's eyes dart like a hawk's. The cousin's right hand disappears under the table, and the next moment a discreet pinch is felt. His smile dies. He dabs his mouth with a napkin and resumes an expression of solemnity as though nothing has happened. Humor is a vice that must be kept under the table and out of sight. Tea arrives in a cloud of steam, poured from a pot that has been boiling somewhere behind a closed door. The porcelain cup is dainty and filled too strongly. The aroma is astringent and military. Milk is added, followed by a measured spoon of sugar for those permitted. You are not. The tea finger stings your throat with its bitterness, and for a second, you taste the only genuinely indulgent thing at the table. Nostalgia for the reckless joy of a laugh. Then the cup is reclaimed and set down, its saucer aligning with a faint, authoritarian click. You are conscious of the small humiliations that make up the day. Your napkin is folded incorrectly. The mistress catches your wrist and repositions it, her touch a lesson in precision rather than tenderness. You swallow another mouthful of porridge. Your hands are prunny from the heat. Your fingers leave crescent moons on the lip of the bowl. The child across from you, who was scolded yesterday for chewing bread too loudly, keeps his mouth shut and his eyes lowered. In this house, noise itself is an index of character. When the last of the porridge is scraped into a dull heap, a bell from the study chimes twice. It is the signal. Bowing like a regiment, hands find the rims of chairs and rise. The spoons clink one last time. You feel a small liberation, not because you are full, but because you have survived the ritual without failing. The footman lifts. Your bowl, it leaves your hands with the muffled sound of compliance. You stand, but you do not breathe freely yet. There will be lessons later, measurements of your moral fiber, and perhaps a ledger of chores. For the moment, you step away from the long table and the heavy expectations it carries, leaving behind the stain of spilled milk, a smoothed seam of napkin, and the faint taste of iron on your tongue. You move through the doorway into the hallway and feel the world shift a degree. Outside, the city will still smell of tar and damp wool, but that is not what you are carrying with you. The weight is internal, a muscle tightened into habit, an ear tuned to the slightest disapproval. Breakfast has made a quiet citizen of you, efficient and small. You tuck that polished restraint beneath your coat like a secret and walk on. You are led, more guided than walked, into the parlor before you have time to think. The door shuts with the soft finality of a verdict. Light from a high sash window slices across the carpet in a pale, patient strip. Dust hangs in it like a congregation of moths. A brass candlestick sweats pale wax onto the mahogany. The wick spits now and then, a small domestic thunder that is immediately swallowed by the room's expectation. You fold your hands because everyone else does. You fold them the way a seam is stitched quickly, evenly, with no stray finger. Your palms touch, fingertips meet. Your elbows rest on knees that buzz with the dull ache of staying still too long. The bench under you is narrow and hard. The varnish has smoothed a groove where the family sits each morning, and if you shift an inch, your cheekbone brushes the edge. You breathe through your nose because the sound of your own breath can betray you. You keep your eyes low so you will not be caught studying the pattern of the wallpaper or the flaked gilt on the picture frames. At the head of the room, your father, or the gentleman tasked to stand in for him this morning, opens the Book of Common Prayer with a practiced, economical crack. Paper and cloth exhale at the same time. He does not look at you. His attention is a pivoting column that can swing toward any misstep. When he says, "Let us humbly confess our sins," it is not a suggestion. It is a blueprint. You confess quietly, in the voice you learned for these moments, the voice that will not soften into laughter even when your stomach twinges for want of breakfast. The words are heavy with years of repetition. You mouth them in a rhythm that has been taught since you were small, not from the heart but from a ledger. Almighty God, Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the phrase moves through you because it has always moved through you. You feel the print of the hymn book's leather against your thumb. Ink smells faintly of iron and dust. Someone's marginal notes are ghosted in an old hand. Remember the poor. It is an instruction and a reproach both. The house exhales as the prayer progresses. Boots scuff on the hearth. A maid enters with a tray and pauses, eyes down. She hips the tray to steady a pewter cup. You see her knuckles pale with effort. The cup clinks, a tiny, unavoidable punctuation. Heads incline by a degree. Your own shoulder tightens because the noise has to be punished by silence. The maid carries on, the sound of her skirts a low tide. Later, when the cup is poured, the tea's steam will smell like the port and the coal yard like other people's work. For now, the tea is a breath deferred. Someone in the back, a cousin perhaps, whose voice has a tendency toward mischief, lets a whisper try to curl out. It is the quantum of a sound, almost nothing, and it is snatched back by a forefinger at the mouth from the ant beside him. The ant's nail presses so hard that the cousin's lips pale. He blinks and becomes a study in contrition. You think of how small resistances gather. A cat that slips under the curtain and desires a stroke becomes a rebellion. Giggles become the crack that lets light into a condemned place. You keep yourself from any such fissure. You are a map without creases. Halfway through the prayers, the little brother two down from you gives an audible hiccup, an involuntary punctuation in the sentence of the day. The governess's hand, when it lands on his shoulder, is not a touch of comfort. It is a correction that presses his spine straight. She does not hiss or scold. She simply adjusts him like a seamstress setting a collar, and the prickle on the boy's ear is a lesson. The body must learn to obey before it learns the words. He swallows, and the hiccup is swallowed with it. You learn to make small noises look accidental, and to make your face a neutral room in which no feelings may stay. A page is turned with a careful, ceremonious sound. The psalm is read aloud. The cadence lifts and falls, and you recite along because your mouth has been trained like a metronome. The words are sometimes clearer than the sense. Doctrines and admonitions tumble in a language made noble by repetition. You do not ask what certain lines mean for your life. Questions are a luxury afforded to grown men and clergymen. If your mind travels, if it pictures a field beyond the house where boys run untroubled or a river that smells of algae in summer, you check it fast. Imaginations are small fires, and fires are not permitted in the parlor. There is a small incident, the sort that will be recounted with a dry, moral little laugh at dinner. A spaniel, ancient and opinionated, threads his nose under the skirt of the lady at the foot of the table. He sneezes. The sneeze is human-like and enormous. It breaks the room's surface tension. The lady's hand jerks, the napkin flutters, and for one suspended beat every person's composure shows the map of their private discomfort. An exhale, a suppressed smile, an eyebrow. The master's voice snaps back the attention. The dog is shooed. The incident becomes a test. Who can remain properly stunned into decorum? You learn to measure your fidgeting not only by what is seen, but by what is felt. Everything in your body becomes a list of things to be managed. Knees, hands, fingers, tongue. You tuck the urge to scratch behind your teeth and count the minutes in the beat of your heel against wood. You practice the stillness until your limbs are the sort of obedient furniture that complements the room. When your foot twitches a fraction, the gaze at your shoulder is small but precise, like the sight of a tailor finding a rough stitch. You correct yourself before correction arrives. Rehearsal becomes survival. The prayers finish the way they began, with a quiet that holds for a breath. Then the closing sentence, "Let us go in peace," is a blessing that is also an order. Your body obeys, you rise as if on a string. Clothes rustle. The bench creaks more than it did before. You step back into the bustle that follows, the rustle of aprons, the call of the cook downstairs, the little business of the day kicking to life. And the stillness of the room seems to stay inside you, a pebble lodged in the shoe of your attention. Outside the window, the street is beginning to fill with the same ordered bustle, tradesmen, carts, the clacking of sabots. Inside, the ritual has done its work. You have been trained in the quiet arts. To make obedience look like devotion, to fold discomfort into religious expression. The praise given in those minutes is not warmth so much as calibration. The prayers have given you a place to put your anxiety, the same way each thing in the house has its proper shelf. You learn the grammar of subordination here. Later, you will use it to speak without sounding like a child. As you walk away, you fold the silence you have practiced into the rest of your day. The lesson is not just that you must not move your body. It is that you must not let your body betray you. You step into the schoolroom and the first thing that seizes you is the sound. 1,000 tiny scrapes as quills cross paper and slate pencils score the boards. The tinny ticking of a distant kitchen clock. The low, persistent rasp of someone clearing a throat. The light is thin, filtered through a sash window rimed with grime. It falls in a flat, merciless strip across the long table where you and the other children sit, shoulders close enough that your elbows touch. Air tastes of damp wool, cold iron, and the metallic tang of ink. Everything feels edged, fingertips pricked by cheap paper, cuffs stiff with starch, the chair legs uneven on the plaster floor. Your seat is one of a row. The older children sit nearest the teacher's desk, backs straight as if carved. The littlest ones cling to slates, smudging answers with impatient fingers. There is no idle chatter. Silence is a curriculum as exacting as arithmetic. The woman at the front, stern, flat-voiced, hair scraped back until her face reads bone, holds a book like a weapon. Her eyes travel the class, and you have the peculiar sensation that she can pluck a wandering thought from your head and pin it to the wall. Reading is ritual. You begin with the Bible because every lesson is scaffolded with scripture. Short phrases intoned, then repeated. "Honor thy father and thy mother," the teacher intones, and you answer in chorus until your voice is a riff, stripped of personal timbre. Letters are not toys for amusement, but blocks that build a moral architecture. Words like obedience, thrift, industry. Every story has a point, and every point has a punishment attached somewhere, if only implicitly. When she reads the parable of the talents, the moral sheen applied afterwards is merciless. Squander not your gifts lest you be called slothful and cast out. You read the same passages until they have the texture of a mantra. They cling to you the way cotton lint clings to wool. The mechanics of literacy are mercilessly practical. Steel nibs glisten in inkwells. You dip, press, smudge, blot with rough-edged paper that smells faintly of lemon and dust. Your palm gets ink-stained as if signal of guilt. The teacher circles, watching for unformed letters for the lopsided tails of your G's. When you falter, when you confuse a P and a Q, when your hunch of there becomes there, a ruler slaps the palms of your hands. Not loudly, the sound is a dry punctuation that punctures the classroom's composure. Pain is infrequent enough to be terrifying, and that makes it more effective than anything louder. Arithmetic is a different sort of grind. You are taught to carry and borrow until the operations are reflex. Sums are rehearsed until your fingers count in a cadence that would be useful in a factory. You work on slate, scratching numbers, wiping them clean, starting again. The slate is cold and leaves a trace of chalk dust that settles into your sleeves. For more advanced pupils, there are columnar accounts, ledgers in miniature. One boy, proud to be of use, practices calculating wages as if the family business might be his one day. The sums are blunt lessons in economy and hierarchy. You learn quickly that numbers are not abstract, they equal food, coal, rent. A miscount is not just wrong, it is a failure of future provision. Between the formalities are the smaller, knobbier lessons. How to tie a bow neatly, how to curtsy until your knees threaten to tremble, how to stand with hands folded and chin down while the teacher evaluates your outward propriety. These are the moral drills. You copy maxims in faint, careful script. Industry is the mother's friend. Pride goes before a fall, and if your copy lacks neatness, the maxim assumes the shape of your own failing. Your moral education is both lecture and slow, public demonstration of what not to be. A few incidents break the lesson in ways that are instructive and mercilessly mundane. Midway through a particularly long spelling section, a small boy in the front row appends his ink bottle with an elbow. The dark pool spreads across his workbook like a stain of shame. The teacher does not scream. She wipes her hands, stoops, and with the mechanical precision of a surgeon takes the boy's slate and makes him recopy every exercise he has ruined. The boy's face is shrinking into itself, the red in his cheeks leaching like color from old prints. Later, when he reaches for a handkerchief, the teacher grips his wrist so hard the vein stands out. Not a pinch born of cruelty, but a demonstration. Accidents are preventable, she seems to say, and the lesson ends in obedient silence and more writing. Across the room, a girl with a cough sits with a hand tucked under her jaw. Her cough is a dry rasp that pierces the hush and then retreats, as if ashamed. She is told to raise her chin, to repeat a verse, to be seen but not heard. The teacher eyes her with something like calculation. Too weak, perhaps, too weak, and the family will be shamed. She is made to stand at the window for a time, breath visible in the cold air like a tiny repentant ghost, then sent back to her seat with a stiff warning about laziness of the body and mind. Illness is an inconvenience to the lesson, and the lesson is paramount. Another small drama unfolds when a girl is found with a scrap of bread hidden in her sleeve. Hunger is a language the school will not translate sympathetically. Her concealment is interpreted as theft, cunning, a moral failing. The bread is confiscated, her hands are slapped with a ruler, and she must stand and confess, out loud, her shame. The room watches. Shame administered publicly is as much a tool as the slate and ruler. Between the recitations and the punishments, there are the quieter educationals, the soft, stubborn forging of conscience. You learn to correct your posture as an act of self-discipline. You learn to make the right noises at the right moments so others will think you correct. You are taught to value punctuality as if time itself were currency. You are forced to memorize prices and prayers with equal urgency. The teacher uses stories of poor children who fell into vice and villains who prospered only briefly. The moral is never subtle. Fear and praise live next to each other in the same breath. When the lesson finally breaks, you are grateful in a way that feels almost animal. The bell, an old metal thing that sounds like a ship's bell in miniature, lets you out into a corridor perfumed with boiled cabbage and coal smoke. You file past the teacher, and she inspects your hands for ink, your sleeves for crumbs, your expression for the right mixture of contrition and pride. You step out into daylight and the air seems enormous, though it is still heavy with the city's soot. Children scatter like seed blown on wind, some to chores, some to further drills, all to the same relentless day. You carry away more than knowledge. You carry the lesson that learning is less about curiosity than conformity. The words you have learned feel like new clothes you must wear until they fit your shape. You say you're reading aloud on the way downstairs, an automatic prattle of scripture and sums, practicing the rhythms that will make you safe. Even outside, the slate's cold ghost seems to cling to your palm, and you suspect that long after the ink fades, the habit of holding your tongue in the company of authority will outlast the book. You stand at the front of the schoolroom with the slate clutched between your palms, fingers slick with the sour tang of lemon squeezer ink. The teacher's spectacles are a dark speck against a face set like old boot leather. Sunlight from the tall sash window draws a pale rectangle across the floorboards, dust motes swarming like tiny, indifferent witnesses. Your spine is a tense wire. You have been asked to copy a line of copperplate, to curve each letter like a soldier's shoulder, and your hand, nervous, cramped, has made a scrawl that leans like a drunk trying to read the map. Again, she says, the word is a blade. The ferrule, a heavy, varnished ruler with a metal edge, rests on the teacher's desk, catching light. You know that look. It lives in your collar. It is not a threat so much as a promise. You press the nib of your pen into the slate, try to smooth your loops. Ink beads, refuses to flow or flows too quickly, blotting like a spilled thought. A classmate coughs. The clock over the mantel ticks. Somewhere below in the kitchen, a kettle murmurs on the hob, but the noise is swallowed by the schoolroom's cold hush. Sloppy, she says. The word makes the pupils around you stiffen, as if someone has struck a bell. The ferrule flicks from desk to palm. You watch it moving because you cannot do anything else. She taps your wrist once with the ruler, hard enough to make your fingers jolt, but not yet to break the skin. Your breath explodes out of you. You taste metal. You try to smile to show you are. Contrite, your mouth trembles and looks like a child's attempt to stitch a wound. The first strike is for the handwriting. Her hand is steady. The ruler lands across the fleshy part of your palm, the sting running up your forearm like a small, screaming thing. The second strike finds the same place, your knuckles jerk. You think of the drills you have memorized, shoulder, elbow, wrist. The third strike is heavier. A thin star appears on your skin, an angry red punctuation. You feel foolish, as if your handwriting had not been bad so much as insulting. There is an older boy, Thomas, in the back who miscounts the sum the teacher asked him to solve. He misreads 20 as 12 because his eyes are blinking against the light. The canon of the classroom, the cane kept for boys who err in arithmetic, hangs on a hook by the door, a polished thing with the faint scent of old leather. When it comes out, Thomas goes pale. He is sent to kneel on the flagstones by the fireplace, the cold pressing through his breeches. The cane cracks across the air. The sound is worse than the strike itself. It slices like a blade. He stifles a yell and bites his lip until the blood lines the shell of his teeth. When he returns to his desk, his face is wet, and the wet is not all sweat. You have seen worse. You remember a day last winter when little Elsie, no more than 5, spilled her ink pot and smeared it over her pinafore. Her mother, who doubles as the house's mistress and moral censor, sat her on the broad knee and twisted her ear until she howled. Then she made Elsie stand out in the corridor in a thin shift to learn the virtue of cold. The salt of her tears crusted on her lashes. That time you watched from the doorway with a crust of bread in your hand, too frightened to step in and too ashamed to laugh. Back in the schoolroom, the teacher frowns at you as if you have committed a felony by not executing your O's correctly. She has a way of talking that assumes you are both stupid and sinful. Copy these lines 100 times, she dictates, sliding a sheet like a verdict across your desk. And then your mother will be informed. That threat carries the weight of scandal in small circles. A letter sent home, a hand corrected by your mother, the shame of being pointed out at supper. Children around you begin to copy with frantic neatness, nibs scraping. The scent of ink becomes a field of tiny religions, dogma in blue-black. You take the pen and write, each repetition a dull ritual. Your hand seizes. The letters start to crowd. The teacher's patience, like cheap glue, begins to snap. Suddenly she taps the ferrule against the palm of her other hand and points to you. Up, she orders. You get up. The wood creaks. The boys in the back murmur, a low, nervous tide. The cane swings once in the air and your knees go weak. There is a classical irony to the punishment itself. You are chastised for not being tidy, for failing at the small art of making your letters look respectable. Yet the punishment smudges more than it corrects. Ink dots the place where the ruler struck and forms a constellation against your skin. Your wrist aches in a way that tells you how often this happens here, how small offenses build into a landscape of pain. A younger sibling waits at home, Rebecca, who learned once to sew a hem so crooked it made the mother laugh, and for that laugh was sent to mend it until her fingers bled. She is not in the room now. Her punishment is a memory that tastes like vinegar. You imagine her in the kitchen with a darning needle, the glow of the range on her cheek, while your own palm sharpens its memory of the ferrule. The household is an ecosystem of small cruelties meted out to polish children into acceptable shapes. Once the immediate hurt dulls into a dull buzz, the teacher has you kneel on the floor to copy lines as penance. Your knees are bruised, the boards imprinting their pattern through your stocking. Outside, a cart clatters past, bells ringing. Inside, the lesson continues as if nothing momentous has occurred. Arithmetic problems proceed, Latin conjugations rattle off, the steady metronome of discipline. The other children pretend not to look, but their faces show calculation. Who will be punished next, and for what triviality? When the day ends, you walk home with your hand wrapped in a scrap of linen. The bruise will bloom violet by nightfall. You rehearse excuses for the dinner table, cold, clumsy, a blot of ink that ruined the paper. Your mother might scold, she might smooth your hair, or she might read the report the teacher sent and sigh with the same tired pity that has lined her face for years. Perhaps, if you are lucky, she will give you a piece of warm bread and forget to tell you to be better. The cane will be put back on its hook, the ferrule returned to the drawer. The instruments of correction sit in the corner like household fruit, inescapable, ordinary. You press your palm to the tepid window pane on the walk home and make shapes in the condensation, trying to write your name one more time, to curve your letters into something that will not make them frown. Your handwriting wobbles. The letters look like they have learned obedience too late. You do not like the look of them, and you do not like the feeling in your wrist, but you already know that tomorrow the teacher will ask you to write again, and the instruments will be waiting. You sit at a narrow, beat-up table beneath a sash window, the glass fogged by a morning that smells of coal and damp hay from the street below. A single gas bracket sputters above, throwing a pool of weak light across the row of slate boards where you and the other children bend like lopsided saplings. The slate is cold under your wrist, an unyielding gray plane that drinks the chalk as if it were trying to swallow your very effort. When you press the chalk to the surface, it hisses, a small, bright, squeaking protest, and a sharp line appears. The chalk dust fans across your fingers, blackening the creases and lodging beneath your nails until they itch. Your governess stands at the front, a living metronome of corrections. She wears gloves even indoors, though hers are thin and her hands are bony. She taps a ruler against the palm of her hand to set the pace. Her copybook lies open on the lectern, every letter a tiny model of perfection. Ovals like coins, tails that curl into neat filigree, crossbars that never stray. Penmanship, she says, is the visible evidence of a mind in order. Your teacher's mouth tightens whenever your O's wobble or your H's forget their loops. The punishment for slovenly script is not mere scolding. It is the deliberate, prolonged repeat. Do it again until you can do it properly. So you do. Your shoulder knots, your forearm aches, and still your letters slant like a line of soldiers who have had too much ale. You learn to hold the chalk as if it were a live coal, not too close to the tip, not too far. The rhythm matters. Downstroke, up curl, pause at the top, sweep of the wrist. You watch your neighbor's hand. A girl with a jaw like iron who lays the chalk down as if scoring a battlefield. Her slates are a landscape of practice, and she wipes the dust away with a damp cloth that smells faintly of soap and disinfectant. When she lifts the cloth, the slate gleams, ready again for punishment. The governess favors that girl, commending her on the quiet lines she makes. Praise in this house is a rare coin. You feel it like heat flaring under skin when it arrives. There is a small, ridiculous freedom to the slate. Mistakes are temporary. You breathe heavily, press your thumb against the surface, and the loop you ruined is gone with a quick rub of the sleeve. But the erasure does not take the memory of the wrong stroke. It sits behind your eyes, a tiny electric ache, the knowledge that the next letter must be better, that sloppiness is a moral failing. You chalk, you erase, you chalk again. Your fingers seize into the cramped claws of someone who has been doing this since dawn. The joints protest. You stretch secretly, and the governess's hawk eye finds you. Sit properly, she says. You sit properly. A tiny hand, sticky from jam, creaks open the door, and a servant comes in with a tray. The smell of burnt porridge is strong enough to pull at your tongue. The porridge itself steams like fog. A boy a few seats down sneezes as a stray bubble of steam pops and sprays his slate with a splattering of soggy grain. He gasps, then laughs, and the laugh is a soft, dangerous thing. The governess clamps down like a lid on a kettle. What do you think you are? A barn, she hisses, and the boy's grin dissolves. He wipes his slate frantically with the hem of his shirt, and then, to cover the blot, scrawls a tiny sun in the corner, an act so absurd that a ripple of suppressed mirth courses through the room. It is stifled quickly by the ruler. Left-handedness is another small social crime that rears its head in this quiet war. A boy at the far end of the room, you can tell by his narrow back and wide shoulders that he is older, begins with his left hand. His letters are neat in a crooked, defiant sort of way, the strokes reversed as if he writes in a mirror. The governess sees it in a blink. She approaches with a calm that makes your stomach hollow. Not so, she says, and with the clinical efficiency of someone managing a stubborn beast, she takes his hand and guides it into the right posture. He cries out, a short sound swallowed by the room. The boy fights it for a week. Hands are stubborn things. Eventually, your neighbor's right hand letters match the others, stiff and polite and obedient, and the governess nods as though victory has been won in a larger battle. A fly, bolder than any of you, finds the open inkwell of a visiting uncle's fountain pen that lay on the windowsill beside a carefully penned ledger. The insect somersaults and sinks, leaving the water-black surface rippling. The uncle, having been invited to observe the morning, frowns, sets the pen down, and leaves a blot that rests like a dark stain on the ledger page. He mutters about carelessness and the fragility of tools. That blot becomes a lesson. Keep your hands clean, keep your tools upright, let nothing interfere with order. You keep your chalk in a damp cloth pouch to prevent it from crumbling. You lick the pad of your thumb to turn a page, taste the chalk, and feel an embarrassing childishness in the act. Someone near you coughs, and a puff of dust rises like a tiny cloud, and the governess looks, and the room snaps back to the spell of the copybook. There is a grotesque poetry to the way your fingers respond. Each paragraph your teacher dictates, a steady hand betrays a steady mind. You copy in small, controlled loops. Your wrist becomes a metronome, your knuckles whining. The hair on your arms prickles from the cold that has nothing to do with the window. Once, you notice a blister forming where the chalk rubs against the back of your index finger. You ignore it until it bursts, and the sting is a private, burning punctuation. You clamp a scrap of cloth around the tender spot and keep writing because to stop is to invite the question. Are you tempted to shirk? You are not yet. Time loses shape in the monotony. The clock above the mantel ticks with a steady indifference. In the silence between the ruler's rests, you hear the scrape of chalk like a tiny saw, the rustle of skirts, the distant clip-clop of a carriage on cobbles, and the far-off laugh of a market woman. You begin to see meaning where there may be none. The tilt of an S becomes an admission, the boldness of an E a character trait. Your handwriting is discussed in the parlor as proof of improvement, as someone else's measure of you. When the practice ends and the slates are stacked like a small coffin mound, your hands shake from cold, from effort, from the odd relief of release. The governess collects them with clinical satisfaction, tucks a ribbon around the neatest one, and pins a notation in the ledger. Your name, written by another, is a little different now. You return the slate to its place on the shelf, wiping your palms on your skirt until the chalk dust is less obvious. Outside the window, a cart creaks past, and the world continues in its messy, noisy way. Inside, discipline has been reasserted in ink and chalk, and the slow architecture of practice strokes. Your fingers ache, but they have learned something. That obedience can be taught through the hand, that the body can be trained to tell a story the mind is supposed to live up to. You rest them in your lap and feel the aftertaste of chalk on your tongue, a stubborn, gritty token of the morning's labor. You step out through the back door, and the world changes its temperature. Inside the house, everything has the taut, papered air of instruction. Outside, the garden smells of things being alive in spite of instructions. The gravel under your boots gives a soft, precise crunch, each footfall a punctuation mark that must not be skipped, altered, or improvised. The path is a ribbon of small stones, swept into neat arcs by the gardener's broom each morning, so the sound of walking does not stray into disorder. You are expected to keep that sound even, like a metronome for proper behavior. A low wind moves through the yews and makes the clipped leaves whisper like pages. You can smell damp earth, yes, but also the sharp, green sting of cut rosemary, and the heavy, slightly metallic scent of roses that have been pruned and bandaged with ribbon for the fair later this week. There is a greenhouse against the south wall, a long, glimmering jewel of glass panes and dripping condensation where palms and pelargoniums are. Kept warm, a faint mist hovers over the glasshouse panes. Inside, the air will be tropic and humid enough to steam your spectacles. For now, you are in the open, where the sun is polite and distant. Your hands are folded in front of you because that is how hands behave outdoors. You do not swing them. You do not tap. Your elbows are contained. Your fingers are not instruments but props. You walk slowly, counting steps in your head if you must, because laughter can start in the counting and running can begin with a miscount. The rule is absurd and therefore absolute. Do not run, do not laugh. It is easier to obey a small tyranny than to negotiate one. A gullible sparrow hops along the edge of the path, searching for crumbs. It does not understand class distinctions. You see it peck at a stray cheese crust and then flutter back into the gravel, less than a foot from your shoe. An old woman in the kitchen apron, Mrs. Pritchard, who tends the flower beds and keeps the seed catalogs like talismans, watches from the greenhouse doorway. She spits tobacco out of the corner of her mouth and calls the bird a foolish thing. She does not shoo it away, because it is wrong to interfere with small lives if doing so necessitates excitement. You notice how the gardener keeps his hands in his pockets when he passes. He does not wave or greet the children by name, because familiarity would require a pause in the march of his day. A young cousin, Tom, tries the forbidden. He takes off in a short run, a foolish, bright burst toward the sundial at the center of the lawn. For a second, the air tastes like possibility. His cheeks are pink, and he looks like some advertisement for childhood that the family could never allow. The governess, Miss Halford, changes color the way a sky changes before rain. She snaps the word stop, and the word is a crack. It dissolves Tom's grin and he comes to a halt, chest heaving, hands shoved into his pockets as though trying to hide the fact he has lungs. Miss Halford's finger taps the rule into the air. Walking, Thomas. He apologizes, muttering the single syllable expected of penitent children, and is ordered to sit on the low stone bench while the rest of you proceed in proper, quiet procession. He sits like a small statue of shame. You pass the croquet lawn, a ritual expanse of clipped grass and willow hoops. A matron from the terrace is instructing two girls in the fine toleration of leisure. How to hold the mallet properly, how to appear cheerful without laughing. Their lips move in tiny, practiced smiles. A footman in livery, with his brass buttons dull from polishing, bends to pick up a fallen hoop, and a moth flutters out from beneath it. He startles, then corrects himself and returns to the posture demanded by courtyard life. Rigid, unobtrusive. Faintly apologetic for being human at all. The moth scrabbles a bit against the stone and then is gone. Another minor calamity unfolds in the herb border. Little Mary, still new to being small in a big house, kicks up a smear of mud on the hem of her frock. The nursery maid, who is efficient in the way of all good domestics, arrives and makes a face so severe that you can see the problem described without needing words. "Now, Mary," the maid says briskly, "you must come with me and we shall restore you to respectability." Mary's face crumples into that peculiar Victorian expression of contrition, practiced even in infants, and she allows herself to be led away without a fuss. The maid produces a silver basin and some coarse soap, and with no ceremony, shows you that tidying is not always about cleanliness, but about returning a small human to the ranks of acceptable presentation. A foxglove leans into the path, bruised and heavy. Someone, perhaps the butler's son, has been there earlier and cut a single bloom to press between pages. That small theft of beauty is the only rebellion you catch. It is private and quiet and speaks more of affection than of defiance. You think of pocketed flowers pressed for later, of furtive smuggled crumbs of cake, and realize those small rebellions are the household's secret oxygen. From the west walk comes the sound of a lawn sprinkler, old brass sputtering, the hiss like a soft applause. An ant perched on the veranda, knitting the same cable row forever, watches everything with lorgnette in hand. She blinks slowly. When two children break eye contact and exchange a conspiratorial glance, she raises her eyebrow in the most precise way possible. The message is clear and old. Amusement is permitted only as a display, not a habit. You feel the weight of her gaze land on your shoulders like a garment that must not rumple. At the far end of the path, there is a statue of a classical boy with a broken instrument. Marble chipped at the nose, as if the winds of many seasons have been cousins to the household's strictness. A pigeon lands, surveys the marble, and coos with a sovereign indifference to decorum. You imagine what it must be to live as the pigeon does. No rules about laughter, no instructions on the pitch of your smile. The thought tickles something small in you, but you clamp it down. You do not laugh. You do not run. You stop at the old wrought iron bench because Miss Halford said you may rest here, but only for 5 minutes and only if your hands remain folded and your back straight. The bench is cold. Frost lingers in the grooves and you can feel a dampness seep into the wool of your sleeve. The garden smells of later autumn, crushed mint, something faintly fermenting from the compost heap, smoke from the coal fires that will feed the drawing room this evening. Bee drags itself across a late blossom, heavy as though it bears the weight of every rule. You watch it struggle and feel absurdly, humanly moved. This break is prescribed, to expend no energy at the expense of order. It is a little lesson slipped between the lessons. How to be a person who can inhabit sunlight without making a scandal. You obey because obedience makes you visible as the kind of child the household collects and preserves. You obey because the alternative, however tempting, the running, the laughing, the full-throated human chaos, would be noticed, recorded, and corrected. Still, in the small private spaces between hedges and hoops, you imagine the laughter as a humming under your tongue, ready to bloom if only some other place, some other time, allowed it. You stand in the parlor with its wallpaper of faded roses and the tick of a long-case clock measuring out small humiliations. Light from the high windows pools on the polished floorboards and catches in the silver tray where a teapot breathes hot steam. The room smells of warmed milk, lemon oil used on the furniture, and the faint, sharp perfume of bergamot from the tea leaves. Cloth is everywhere. Your skirt is a rigid hemisphere of starched petticoats. The sleeve of your jacket creaks when you lift your arm. Every fold seems to have an opinion about the way you move. A woman who could have been carved from elm sits opposite you on a straight-backed chair. She is the instructor, an elderly cousin of manners, or the family's chosen preceptress. Her mouth a narrow line, and her voice the kind that proposes corrections rather than suggestions. She carries a fan not to cool herself but as a measuring stick. When she snaps it open, it is a sentence. Eyes, she says at the first correction, not at the feet of your host. You lower your gaze as instructed and immediately feel a prick of shame for noticing the way her ring catches the light. She demonstrates the curtsy as if demonstrating an arcane ritual, heel tucked, knees soft, back straight as though a string runs from the crown of your head to the ceiling. Not too low, she corrects. Too low is vulgar, too shallow is rude. The curtsy must say, I know my place and I know yours. You try. Your skirt swishes, the layers brush against the damask of the chair. You feel the heel of your shoe slide on the polished wood and your knees complain. The fan smacks the air in a small, authoritative clap. Again. Practice repeats until your muscles learn to make humility look elegant. There is a tiny ceremony to the angle of your head, not submissive, not imperious, a balance that sells deference without suggesting infirmity. A portrait of Lady Meriwether watches from the wall, painted in a gown of sable and pearls. The instructor insists you curtsy to the portrait too. One must respect rank. Even when the rank is painted, she intones. The abstraction of it doesn't make it any less humiliating. You move on to the bow and exercise in restraint. The POSD of a gentleman, the bow must be executed from the waist. The knees remain still, the hands fall into the natural crease of the coat or skirt so nothing looks contrived. Your instructor demonstrates with a wooden spoon because she thinks any object sharpens the eye. She plucks at an imaginary lapel and tilts forward, the spoon clearly implying the invisible presence of a gentleman. Do not bend at the waist like a tree in a storm, she says. Bend as a blade. Controlled. You imitate her, counting silently. 1, 2, rise. A distant footman shuffles in the hall, and the clock chimes the quarter hour as you practice slow, deliberate movements, as if time itself is being taught a lesson. Then the teacup, the day's main test. The silver tray arrives, the teapot wheeze and steam, the porcelain a pale moonlight in your hands. You are told to keep your left hand poised under the saucer, not to cradle the cup with both hands like a peasant warming themselves by a stove. The instructor watches your grip and corrects your thumb placement as if rearranging the bones of a clock. Pour, she says, and you do. The stream is almost perfect, a narrow ribbon. A bead of tea clings to the spout. The instructor pinches it off with a napkin as if performing surgery. There's an incident. A sprightly spaniel from next door, heard more than seen, knows past the open French doors and slips in underfoot. It snuffles at the hem of your skirt, startling you enough to jolt your hand. The teapot wobbles. Tea splashes into a saucer and onto the floor. The woman's face doesn't shift into anger, she is above theatrics, but her fingers tighten until her knuckles show. A footman hurries in, mutters an apology and scoops up the dog with more gentleness than you will ever receive. The spaniel, entirely unperturbed, licks at the spilled tea like a connoisseur. You resume. The second incident is quieter. The youngest girl in the room, no older than 7, forgets the appropriate distance to keep when a male visitor enters. She skitters forward to examine a button on his waistcoat, the kind of curiosity adults have been trained to call precocious, and the instructor pinches her ear with the gentlest, most civilized reprimand. The child blinks, mortified for a heartbeat, then curtsies as if switched to seriousness. It is brief, almost tender, this correction that teaches obedience through small public shames rather than through outright cruelty. Serving others a cup of tea is more than pouring hot liquid. It is a performance of class. You must announce the brew without excessive enthusiasm, orange, sir, and set the cup and saucer on the tray with a practiced finality. Your wrist should not be too dramatic. Your fingers should not tremble. If the person you serve sighs or fusses, You absorb it like the lining of your skirt, taking the shapes of their dissatisfaction and smoothing them out without comment. There is another incident. A neighboring aunt arrives unexpectedly to inspect progress. She sits, tastes the tea, and pronounces it adequate, which in her lexicon means flawed. She points to the sugar tongs, and the instructor's correction becomes a public lesson on propriety with the weight of a sermon. You witness a girl whose hands are too eager to take sugar fumble and drop a cube. The room gasps, a tiny collective intake of air. And then everyone, adults and children, returns to their posture as though a minor earthquake had passed over the carpet and left only a ripple. Practice drills bleed into instruction about small talk. Never mention illness, never comment on appetite, never laugh loud enough to startle a visiting relative. You learn to keep your responses brief and polished. A question is a test prompt. An answer should be a finished sentence. By the time the lesson winds down, your calves ache from holding curtsies, and the hollow at the base of your neck feels raw from keeping your chin measured. The instructor hands you a cup to carry across the room, as though to say, "Now prove you can do every movement in order without thinking." You walk, holding the tray level as if it were the balance of your family's reputation. A draft brushes past the curtains, the dog whimpers behind the door, the footman adjusts the rug. You set the cup down. Someone says thank you in a tone that means, simultaneously, approval and ownership. You leave the parlor having learned more than how to move. You've learned how to render yourself a small, obedient thing within a larger machine. The ritual of curtsies and tea service makes of a child's body an instrument calibrated to produce respectability. It trains you to smooth away whatever of yourself might threaten the household's tranquility, curiosity, loudness, sudden laughter, and to replace it with a sequence of polite gestures that stand in for character. As you fold your hands and walk away, your fingers still smell faintly of bergamot, and you realize every practiced motion has cost you something invisible. The learning is a subtraction as much as it is an addition. You sit at the edge of the long dining table, and your knuckles white against the varnish. The room smells of boiled cabbage and damp wool, with a ghost of lemon-scented polish that tries and fails to disguise the underlying grease. Outside, the cartwheels grind over cobbles and a bell from the chapel tolls the hour. Inside, a clock on the mantel hisses and takes a breath between each methodical tick, as if even time itself is practicing restraint. Everyone else has been told to keep still. The adults exchange. The occasional measured sentence, a snap of business, a crisp correction, but children are carved into the woodwork. You feel that look land on you, not merely disapproval, but a kind of clinical examination. The governess' eyes travel from forehead to mouth the way a surgeon checks a wound. It's not a gaze that wants to discover you. It's a gaze that wants to design you to specification. You try to clear your throat and your chest tightens. The air is so cold that your breath fogs and hangs like a thin white curtain, then disappears. Your spoon scrapes the bottom of your bowl. The sound is too loud. You mistake your neighbor's ragged cough for a code, and your heart picks up pace. You look down at the porridge, gray, lumpy, and unromantic, and you think about how sound and appetite used to be connected. How you used to sing, hum, shout for more. That life is a whisper now, smothered under a generation's theory that noise equals impropriety. The rule is not whispered, it is drilled. Children should never speak unless addressed. It's not framed as advice. It's a law, the kind learned from a string of heavy tomes stacked in the study, from pages that counsel firmness and accuse affection of encouraging vanity. Your tongue feels like a foreign appendage, its movements unnaturally conspicuous. When a thought wants to escape as a sound, you grip it between your teeth and swallow. A side incident unfolds like a small, cruel comedy. Across the table, Master Arthur, older, impatient, well-practiced at edging the line, lifts his head to ask about the day's lessons. He doesn't finish. The governess' hand snaps down onto the table and her ring clicks like a bell. She does not raise her voice. She does what she has been trained in. She points at the slate in front of him. "Lines," she says. Arthur's face drains. Later, you watch him bent over his slate by candlelight, the whole sentence scraped out 40 times in a cramped, trembling hand. I will speak only when spoken to. He writes it until the letters blur, and the repetition is a kind of erasure. Another incident comes at tea time. Little Maggie, who still has the freckles of a child who plays in the lane, snorts at a joke from the kitchen maid, a brief sparkle of laughter, accidental and untamed. The maid freezes, embarrassed. The governess' mouth thins. "Maggie," she says in a voice that could be measured in inches, "children are not heard, they are seen." Maggie's cheeks go pink as the teacup she holds, and she learns to place a napkin over her mouth to hide the shape of a smile. Later, she stabs at her cake with a fork as if it were a lesson in restraint. You walk this world with the awareness of a hunted thing. Your speech is taxed. Phrases curl in your head and die there like moths hitting glass. When the vicar calls for the children to come forward at Sunday service, the pew is a stage for silence. You are made to recite words, yes, the catechism, the Lord's Prayer, but these are scripts, not conversation. Recitation is allowed because it is ordered. Questioning is not. The paradox is lodged like a burr. You are trained to repeat piety on cue but forbidden to interrogate it. The household has methods. When you err, the correction is precise and often theatrical. Once, in the nursery, a younger boy dared to answer a servant back about a broken toy. The boy's mother, red-faced and terrified of gossip, made him stand upon a footstool in front of everyone while she read aloud from a conduct book about proper submission. He stood there, small and trembling, and all afternoon every servant glanced at him as if he were contagious. His offense, a single sentence, becomes a lesson for the rest of you. You are taught to conflate vocal freedom with social ruin. Yet there are small rebellions, muted and private. You learn to bend language so the sound cannot be pried from you. Eyes do the work words once did. A tilt of the head becomes an argument. A look shared with a sibling across the hearth carries more detail than a dozen slurred questions. At night, when voices are muffled and doors close with the soft click of seals, you whisper in the dark. Those whispers are sacred and secret, like contraband. They taste of tobacco smoke and the lemon oil on the dresser. They are a patchwork of mispronounced words and dangerous plans. If the nursery clock strikes while you whisper, you both freeze like guilty animals. Silence becomes part of the thrill. Outside this house, the rule follows you. In the street, a workhouse boy yells excitedly when a penny drops from a cart. He is scolded by his mother for being undignified. In the market, a shopkeeper snaps at a child who dares to complain about stale bread. Even in scenes of public labor, the child's voice is suspect. It is assumed that a child who speaks up might be an agitator tomorrow, and agitators are a fear that trembles through the middle classes like a draft. You notice the smallest instruments of control. A corrected word written in ink and displayed on a ledge as a warning. A ribbon plucked from a girl's hair and left on her pillow as a reminder of the day's shame. A cane laid across the governess, lapped like a saber ready for winter. The punishments are less about pain than about setting a threshold. You internalize the threshold. You learn to calculate the distance between thought and spoken word, as one calculates how far a servant must stand from a lord. Irony nests everywhere. Adults who preach silence fill rooms with lectures on moral improvement and the latest philosophical treatises. They gather to discuss, to opine, to correct ministers and make speeches. Their voices are the instruments of empire and industry. Yours is a little chord meant to be tuned away. There is a joke among the older children, dark, because dark helps it fit behind the teeth, that the family portrait should have two spaces, one for everyone seen and one for the children to be seen, silent and painted in the margins. When you finally speak, and you will at some precarious point, because silence is not a natural state for a human throat, the sound feels like a breach. Eyes turn. The air seems to block the syllables and play them back to you in slow motion. You learn to measure those moments for their consequences. Sometimes the concession is small, a curt response to a parental question, a yes, ma'am, barked like a trained parrot. Sometimes the cost is larger, and the memory of it makes the other children clutch their spoons a little more tightly. You do not grow up believing you have nothing to say. You grow up knowing that when you speak you will be judged not for the content, but for the social hazard of speaking itself. So you become fluent in silence. You learn its textures, its tastes, its dangers. You learn when a cough is a rebellion and when it is merely a symptom. You learn to listen as a weapon. And in the quiet, your mind composes its own revolutions, sentences that will have to wait for the right moment to become noise. You get your orders the way everything important comes down the household, clipped, final, delivered by a woman whose apron is starched into armor. The housekeeper's eyes are a ledger of wrongs. She hands you a brass-bound pail and a list written in a hand that does not tolerate argument. Builds character, she says, as if the phrase itself were a tool to be used against you. You are expected to nod and accept it like a patient taking medicine. The stairs are cold under your stockings. Your fingers, still damp from washing, clench around the pail's rim as you trudge to the scullery. The doorway hits you with heat and the smell of lye, a sharp, alkaline sting that clears the sinuses and leaves the back of your throat raw. Steam fogs the low windows. A chorus of clinks and slaps rises from a row of women at the washboard like an industrial sea. Metal bowls purr on the stove. A kettle keeps up a patient whistling. Your hands meet the scalding surface of a dish before you learn the lesson of caution. You yelp, someone snorts. Mind your fingers, the cook advises. Not a comfort, only instruction. You start with the small and visible things, sweeping the nursery hearth until the brick looks as if it were new, stretching a broom as if you could press the shape of obedience. Into the dust. Dust comes up in size, little clouds that taste of coal and old wool. You watch it through the sunlight that slices across the floorboards and feel an absurd triumph when the hearth looks straight and honest. The housekeeper inspects and says nothing. Silence is praise, silence is command. Outside, you beat the carpets, an exercise in ritual and public humiliation. You heft the beater and let the rug fly. The carpet answers with a bellows of gray that settles on your hair and lashes. The neighbors glance over the fence with the curiosity of crows. A boy from next door slings a prank at you, a thrown bit of rag that smacks your cheek, and you nearly drop the beater. One of the coachmen, there to fetch the morning mail, watches with a smirk as you try to look dignified beneath a halo of dust. It is a lesson in resilience. When dignity comes with grit, you learn to swallow both. Chores in a Victorian house are a theatrical mix of the small and the hazardous. You are given the task of polishing the master's boots. The blacking paste smells of oil and soot. You smear it on with purpose. A careless twist, and a streak of black runs across your knuckle like a sudden, permanent tattoo. The housekeeper arches an eyebrow, and you, feeling the edge of public correction, dab at it with your sleeve only to smear it more broadly across your cheek. For a wild heartbeat, you consider crying. Instead, you laugh, a thin, useless sound. Laughter is a crime only when it breaks the pattern. You clean up. The boots gleam. A small, comic disaster unspools as you are tasked with fetching a teapot from the sideboard. The china is thin and white and polished until it sings when tapped. You reach, your elbow knocks the tea caddy, and the small thing slides like a traitor. You catch it at the rim, but your fingers slip. It hits the floor with a chorus of fractures. The house fills with a silence so heavy you can hear the clock swallow the second. For a moment, all eyes turn your way like a tribunal. The housekeeper breathes out a historical sigh, less fury than disappointment. She sends you to the coal shed to fetch more instead of plunging into wrath. The punishment is practical. Mend what you can, replace what you cannot, and learn to hold things without breaking them. There are dirtier tasks. Chamber pots must be emptied. Their contents make a small, bitter smell that stains memory. You learn to carry them with the same concentration you apply to the master's teacup. The pots clink as you descend the stairs. Every step threatens to betray you. A cat darts under your foot, friction flaring like a bad idea, and the pot sloshes. A single drop leaps from the rim and plunks against the flagstone. You want to laugh or cry and end up doing neither. You are reduced. to a person who steadies pots and straightens shoulders. Another side incident comes when a candle is left too close to a curtain. A small flash, a smell of singed fabric, and quick hands move to smother the little flame. Someone's hair smells of smoke for the remainder of the morning, and the housekeeper uses the moment as a sermon on carelessness. Character, she intones, is not being the sort to set the house alight. The moral lands like ash on the tongue. There is a didactic quality to every small humiliation. You are taught to count, to be precise, to repeat the same motions until the repetition becomes a kind of morality. Mending is an art in patience. Thread passes through wool worn thin at the elbow, and the needle bites and pulls. You learn the names of stitches and ways to hide a repair so that no one notices. The work gives your hands a secret, little calluses like metals. You stitch until the fabric warms to your touch, and later, a tiny area of cloth looks like new and unremarkable. That is the point, to take roughness and make it smooth again. There is also hierarchy in the chores, a chastening geography. The nursery tasks are different from the scullery. The dining room silver requires a different kind of reverence. The butler's presence is an immediate lowering of volume. You polish under his supervision and learn that hands may be marked by work, but must never show the tremor of haste. The sense of always being seen sharpens you into a creature who practices small perfections. It is exhausting. Evenings bring the airing of linens, big sheets shaken out like white flags in the brisk courtyard air. The smell is clean and papery. You help fold with ritual precision, crease upon crease, until the bundles become small, orderly islands. A younger sibling attempts to tuck a doll into a linen bundle and giggles. The housekeeper's lip twitches, permitted frivolity. You are allowed a small reprieve in the laughter, a reminder that not all instruction is severity. It's another lesson. Softness may sneak in, but it must be folded away. By the end of the day, your fingers smell of soap and blacking and old tea. There is a satisfaction in the ache across your shoulders, the proof that something can be fixed, restored, made serviceable by your hands. Building character, in the Victorian sense, is a series of small trials by dust and water, and the occasional shattered teacup. You come to understand that character is taught in repetition. The sweep, the beat, the polish, the daily insistence that one can, with enough practice, become a person who does not break under the small pressures. And yet, beneath the drills and the admonitions, there is a quieter lesson you begin to treasure. The secret dignity of labor. You see, as you scrub and stitch and carry, a kind of competence grows like calluses, ugly and useful. The house may be strict, the rules inflexible, and the phrase build character, worn thin by use. But when you fold the last linen and line up the boots, there is a small, stubborn pride. You have made the domestic world hold together for another day. You have learned the weight of responsibility, and that, in a house where every action is watched, being useful can be its own kind of shelter. You are seated on a hard-backed chair in a room that never seems to forget the shape of warning. The wallpaper has a faded pattern of laurels and lions, a little soot threaded into the creases from the kitchen hearth below. A thin beam of winter light slices through the curtained window, throwing the dust motes into parade formation. You clutch a slate in your lap because that is what you do here. Keep your hands purposefully occupied so the mind does not wander. At the head of the room stands Miss Halbrook, a woman in a black dress so severe it might have been ironed into a posture. Her voice is the instrument of the hour, not loud, but precise, fitting every sentence to the metronome of moral duty. She speaks of idleness as if it were a contagious fever, a small, decorative phrase repeated until it becomes a law. That idle hands beget mischief, and mischief begets ruin. She does not shout, she does not need to. Each word is another nail in the coffin of any thought that dares to veer toward play. You feel the damp of the window pane on your knuckles where the chill has seeped through. Your stocking rubs at the seam, an irritation you cannot scratch because eyes are calibrated for damage. The breathing in the room is a chorus of restraint, everyone inhaling small, practical breaths, making sure they are not deep enough to be mistaken for enjoyment. Miss Halbrook lifts a thin book, the pages browned and margined with pencil marks. It is filled with testimonies and track stories. A tailor's apprentice who lingered at tavern doors, a girl who preferred market gossip to mending, a lad who wasted his hours playing marbles and found himself at 13 apprenticed to a chimney. Her narration is not merely recollection. It is evidence, delivered as though the past were a gallery of wrong choices you will be shown until you can map your future around them. She tells, with a clinical pause, of Tom Langley from the street 2 blocks over, a real boy everyone apparently once knew. Tom had enjoyed dawdling by the bakery, watching the loaves rise, and one day someone offered him a coin for a chore he did not do. He took it and took another, and soon he had grown bold enough for heavier theft, and then he was gone. The room leans forward as if to catch what remains of Tom. You feel a chill that is not entirely the draft from the window. A cup from the side table trembles as the parson who sits near Miss Halbrook shifts his weight. He nods, and his long-fingered hands are the hands of someone who writes sermons, not letters. He produces a Bible and reads a passage about sowing and reaping. The lines are familiar and blunt. Idle seeds will not yield bread. The words hang in the air, and you hear the clock downstairs thud like a distant heart. The room approves the thud. Between the main warnings, there are small, snapping episodes that are meant to illustrate the rules in living hours. A girl at the back, Mary, you think, lets out an audible little giggle at some private thought. Miss Halbrook's gaze drops to her like a drop of vinegar on milk. Giggling, she says, is a wasteful noise. Immediately, Mary is instructed to come forward and mend the hem of Miss Halbrook's handkerchief while everyone watches. She mends clumsily, cheeks coloring under the scrutiny. The hem serves as a lesson sewn in public. A boy in the front row, Thomas, fidgets with his slate until the slate slips and strikes the floor. The sound is small but volcanic in a place where sounds have moral weight. Miss Halbrook stops mid-sentence and extracts from her pocket a ruler. She taps his knuckles, not hard, but with the exactness of a calibrator measuring guilt. The boy's chin trembles. His knees are steady. It is not only the tapping that instructs, but the demonstration. Mistakes are visible and correctable, and must be corrected in front of others, so reasons become embedded. Thomas watches his slate for the remainder of the hour as if it now contains a map of proper conduct. The lecture shifts, turning its lens on mischief, like a detective examining fingerprints. Mischief is not just climbing trees or skipping stones at the canal, it is an attitude. It is leaving a question unanswered. It is telling a small lie to a playmate. It is dawdling over a chore because you think the work beneath you. Miss Halbrook speaks in small, surgical sentences. A boy who willfully wastes light will be a man who wastes coal, she intones. A girl who prefers songs over seam will find her dowry smaller than her sense. The metaphors are domestic and relentless. The household itself is the empire to be defended. Outside, a vendor's cart bounces by, the clatter of wooden wheels punctuating the lecture. Miss Halbrook pauses to glance at the sash window, and then she tells the room about a chimney sweep she saw in a Sunday market, his face as black as the coal he loved, or rather was forced to love. His childhood, she says, was sold for coins. The picture is vivid, little lungs thick with soot, little hands with no time for toys. You can almost smell the soot from her words. The room inhales it. Then comes the tiny, almost comic aside that everyone hushes to hear. Mrs. Beckett, the housekeeper, who has been fetching hot water, and glancing at the children's faces from the doorway, is cited for an example of industry. Once, when Mrs. Beckett was a girl, she is said to have taken up a book instead of spending the afternoon skipping rope. Because she was industrious, she later married a steward and is now in the service of a respectable house. The moral is domestic upward mobility. Read, mend, fold, and you will have a roof that does not tremble when the wind comes. There is an awkward shuffling as those in the room imagine their futures, some with a brittle pride, some with panic. You find there is an odd, almost ritual rhythm to the punishment and the praise. The tales of ruin are as constructed as the tales of redemption. Both are tools. The parson's voice moves from doom to promise. If you are watchful now, you will earn bread and respect later. If you are idle, the mills will have you, the courts will have you, the workhouse will have you. Names are seldom repeated to protect the family, but the outlines are blunt enough. The hour concludes with a short prayer that is part benediction and part inventory. "Let us bless the industrious and reform the idle," murmurs the assembly. You whisper the words with the rest, your mouth moving because that is what is required. The lecture ends, but the lesson blooms into the rest of your day. Every chore will be measured against that sermon. You fold your hands, replace your slate, and step back into a world that has been carefully instructed to mistrust any idle second. The air feels heavier, as if even the breath might be thoughtless if not counted. You adjust your sleeve and prepare to prove to the house, and to yourself, that you are not, in the ledger of the household, a mischief. You are told to stand in the front parlor, and you obey because the governess has that look, thin lips pressed together like a seam pulled taut. The gas mantle flickers above the mantelpiece and throws the nicked mantel clock's face into hard light. The room smells of boiled starch and tea gone cold, with a faint undertow of coal smoke sneaking in from the street. You fold your hands and force your feet not to move. The seamstress will be here any moment, and moving is, in her book, a species of sin. When she arrives, she fills the doorway like a question. Her skirts are patched, the black of them turned to gray at the knees. Her hands are the color of old leather and smell faintly of beeswax and liver of sulfur. She carries a parcel of muslin and a tape measure that hangs like a snake from her neck. No one calls her by her given name. She is Mrs. or Miss, or simply the dressmaker. You watch her set down a box of pins with a clatter that makes a small, intimate sound. In the room, like coins falling into a tin. "Stand up straight," the governess says, and you straighten because that's what the word means. You plant your heels together, you lift your chin. It feels like being boxed in by ropes made of air. The seamstress's gaze runs over you, quick and judging. Shoulder to shoulder, wrist to elbow, that small hollow at your throat. She murmurs something about sitting up or no slouching. Old women's proverbs that seem to attach to the ribs. The tape measure is cold against the back of your neck when she lays it there. It smells of cloth and oil and small, dry things. Dried flowers and notes folded up with the lining of hems. She takes the measurement, the metal tongue at the tape's end biting briefly at your skin. You would fidget to scratch, you do not. Standing still is a performance. Everything you are can be read in inches and seams. Her fingers are quick, practiced. They pinch at the curve of an arm, tuck the tape under a chin, pull, and let go like a fisherman checking a fine line. She nudges the shoulder seam toward where she thinks it ought to sit, and you feel the invisible pressure of fashion and family expectations tightening. For a moment, you imagine the clothes as little houses, each stitch a supporting beam. You are being fitted for the house you will inhabit when you step outside. The day you are seen as respectable, or the day you are marked otherwise. 2 inches more there, she says, as if adding inches to your life will change its shape. Children grow fast. Mind the hems, they'll last longer if you don't play in puddles. Her voice is practical rather than kind. She has sewn stitches into children's childhoods for years and knows each child's future is full of holes she cannot mend. The fabric she holds up is thick, dark serge for a boy's frock, and a plain, coarse muslin under it for lining. If you are a girl, there will be a pinafore to go over everything, a sacrificial layer, stiff from starch, intended to take the brunt of the grubby world. The starch is what frightens you. It crunches when you bend. It makes your movements into the sound of snapping reeds. You think of it as armor, but also as a cage. A pin pricks the side of your hand suddenly, quick and bright. You bite your lip and taste iron on your tongue. The maid reaches out with a handkerchief before you ask, the cotton smelling faintly of lavender. The governess's eyebrow lifts. Someone is always to be disciplined for a dropped stitch or a bleeding finger, even if the pin was yours by accident. A side incident. While the seamstress marks the hem with chalk, white dust like a weak frost, little Tom, your youngest brother, decides he is bored. He ducks under the heavy table, meant for the grand pianoforte, and tugs at the fringe. The fringe comes away and scatters across the floor like a small, decadent snowfall. The governess snatches him out by the scruff and delivers a smack so sharp you hear it in the seamstress's breath. She flinches and then mutters, not unkindly, "Children'll pull, they always do," as if the world itself were made to be pulled. Another small thing happens. A mouse scuttles across the hearth, too bold for a city creature. The seamstress's cat, a thinner, older thing, all elbows and patience, stirs, obliges nature, and makes a half-hearted chase. The cat is unsuccessful because the mouse knows to use the shadow under the chair. Success for the mouse, humiliation for the cat. You find the small drama comforting, an evening's entertainment in miniature that distracts from the larger spectacle. You, measured, turned into numbers. She kneels at the hem to check the fall, and the room becomes anode and cathode of small sounds. The scratching of chalk, the click of boot buttons, the whisper of skirts. Her breath fogs in a small cloud. She tells you about her apprentice who left to marry last year, about an old lady who came in asking for alterations so her mourning would be proper. The seamstress's stories are never about joy. They are practical chronicles of who needs what dress to get by. "Raise the arm," she says, and your sleeve lifts like a flag, exposing a fine pale patch where the sun never reaches. The tape comes across your chest, and for a second you feel measured in a way that isn't physical. Measured against propriety, against how much wear and tear your garments must endure before they are declared fit to be passed down. Clothing isn't merely to keep out the cold. It carries messages, who you belong to, what trade you might enter, whether you'll be invited in or turned away. She marks the seam where the new dress will be eased for growth. "Always allow for growth," she says, with a shorthand nod toward future. You think of the seam as a secret, an allowance for a child's inevitable stretching toward something else, something bigger than the family's purse or the house's size. It is a small kindness in a room otherwise curated for discipline. When she's finished, she steps back, smooths the cloth across your shoulders like a blessing or a verdict, and pins a bold marker on the hem. "Return in a week," she says, packing away her tools. The tape measure coils back around her neck, and the pins settle into their tin, a small metallic chorus. You move your toes in your boots when the door closes, and there is a momentary, delicious sensation of release. But the new dress will be starched, the collar will be stiff, and the hem will limit your stride just enough to remind you of the rules. The seamstress has mapped you in inches and pieces, body, future, place, and left you with a paper pattern and a promise. You are still, but the world will not be. You will have to learn to wear what they cut for you, to make your movements fit the seams, to find ways to be lively within the restrictions. For now, the clothes hang in the parlor in your imagination. A garment and a sentence, stitched together. You step into the children's dining room, and the first thing that hits you is the light. Low, yellow, and stubbornly defiant, little columns of wax burning down in iron sconces that cough occasionally with the draft. The room is smaller than you imagined, more square than grand, with a low table nailed together from dark wood and a row of straight-backed chairs that insist on your spine behaving. The wallpaper is a faded pattern of flowers that once tried to be cheerful and failed. The hearth at the far end is reduced to a glowing pocket of ember. Everything is scaled to children, but nothing here is indulging. It is a place of instruction and plain necessity. A maid ladles broth from a pewter pot into shallow bowls. The liquid is thin, the color of dull gold, smelling of boiled meat and the slight iron tang of the kettle. You move into your place by muscle memory, hands on your knees until allowed, feet flat, eyes on the bowl until instructed otherwise. The governess stands at the head of the table like a lighthouse made of starch. The light from the candles throws hard shadows across her face, and you feel the weight of those shadows as much as you feel her gaze. She does not smile. Smiling, in this room, is optional only if you are very fond of consequences. You lift the spoon. It is heavy with pewter and cold at the rim. The broth hits your tongue like work, warm, a little greasy, shimmering with specks of fat. There is bread, dense, slightly sour, torn in pieces rather than sliced neatly. You dip and sip because you are a child of restraint, and because the governess is counting how you manage the spoon as if every motion were a lesson. The bread soaks the broth and becomes less bread, more sustenance in a damp, resolute way. You chew and the taste is honest. Salt, boiled meat, the faint sting of cabbage if you are lucky. At the far side of the table, little Ben drops his spoon. The clatter is small, ridiculous under the hush. His hand fumbles for it, cheeks flushing, eyes wide. You think he will be allowed to bend and pick it up like anyone else, but the governess's mouth tightens. "No fumbling," she says in a voice that could iron creases. He freezes, spine straightening as if wired, and reaches carefully. The incident should be nothing, but here it is a test of composure, and he passes one breath later. You feel oddly triumphant on his behalf. A candle guttering causes a small, theatrical breath from everyone. Wax spatters into a puddle on the table and rolls toward your sleeve. The maid, who has been working in the background like underrated machinery, reaches with a damp cloth and flicks the wax away with deliberate efficiency. The governess's eyes follow the movement, approving. In this house, spills are teaching moments. A smear of wax on a sleeve is a moral failing in miniature, proof that you need to learn steadiness and self-control. The room smells of several things at once. The prevailing scent of coal smoke and wet wool from outside, the sour tang of the broth, beeswax and candle soot, and the sour of turned-over cloth when an old blanket is folded and used as a cushion. You can feel the chill from the draft that sneaks under the door and edges along the floor. Your shoulders hunch without realizing it. The governess notices and corrects your posture with words as severe as a ruler. You straighten. Your spine remembers to behave. Beside you, Mary, who is 2 years younger but ferociously competitive about bearings and behavior, tucks the corner of her napkin into her blouse like a soldier preparing for a skirmish. She pinches bread with feral concentration and manages to get a fat smear of dripping on her chin. Before she can wipe it, the governess reaches out and drags a stubby finger across Mary's mouth, not cruelly but methodically, as if erasing an accident from a slate. Mary protests with her eyes and then looks away, and you watch the tiny defeat bloom in her face. It is not the end of the world, but in this room small defeats accumulate into character. A mouse scurries along the skirting board and shocks the table into a brief tremor of sound. Everyone's little feet shift, spoons clatter, and a chorus of held breaths makes the air thick. The smallest child squeaks and is immediately hushed. The governess pinches his ear lightly and uses the ear twisting that is more precise than brutal, enough to signal shame without dramatic injury. He blinks, embarrassed, and meets no one's eye for a full minute. The mouse vanishes into a seam in the wall like a secret, carrying with it everyone's unease. Conversation in this room is a lean thing. It exists only if summoned and is always about utility. Who helped in the garden, whether homework is done, who practiced the piano scales, and who shirked. There is no gossip, no laughing at friends' stories. When the younger cousin asks, quietly and quite bravely, whether there will be pudding tomorrow, the governess answers with a question about rationing and thrift. The cousin shrugs and accepts it, because acceptance is what you're learning at table here. Small wants are taught to be moderated early and with ceremony. A servant brings in a tray with a modest bowl of stewed apples and sets it down with a soft clatter. The scent of fruit is a punctuation mark against the flatness of the meal. For a moment there is a scramble, young fingers stretching for an extra piece, and a small conflict plays itself out so fast you might miss it. A lad above you flicks his wrist and slips a sliver of apple toward his sister, who inhales like a forbidden guest. The governess's eyebrow lifts. The lad pretends innocence but is given a tight look and told, quietly and publicly, that generosity must be formal and scheduled, not furtive. He flushes and learns the etiquette of giving under inspection. The light dwindles and the wax grows in small catastrophes, puddles, buckles, reluctant flames. Shadows crawl along the wallpaper and make the flowers look alive and plodding. You finish the broth and push the bowl away on reflex. It's a small signal, Dishes are not a conversation here. Your hands are folded. Someone sweeps crumbs aside with an economy of motion. You feel full in that disciplined way, the kind of fullness that comes from being fed and trained simultaneously. The governess waits for the table to become an assembly of statues, upright, attentive, hands visible. When she nods, it is like a release. Not freedom, but a permission to move toward the next item on the agenda. Washing of hands, inspection of collars, a brisk recitation of prayers. As you rise, the chair scrapes. The wax on the table crackles. Outside, a cart creaks by, the distant sound of a world that keeps turning whether you are well behaved or not. You leave the room smelling of broth and old beeswax, carrying the small, private relief that you have not yet been scolded. You walk back toward the nursery with your bowl empty and your posture corrected, the echoes of the evening ritual tracking behind you like a stern-footed shadow. The bell on the nursery door clangs like a sentenced judge, sharp and final. You drop the spoon back into the empty basin. Porridge clings to the rim in cooled clumps, and the spoon tastes of iron and yesterday's penny roll. Nurse, tight bun, apron streaked with starch, sweeps in with the authority of a bailiff. She says your name like a summons. You stand because you were taught to stand when spoken to, and because you have learned that sitting can be mistaken for laziness, and laziness is a moral failing. You follow her down the corridor, past oil portraits whose painted eyes track you with mild reproach. The house exhales 100 small smells: candle tallow, damp wool tucked away to dry, the sour breath of a chamber pot freshly emptied, a faint thread of boiled cabbage from the kitchens. The nursery is colder than the rest of the house. Upstairs rooms never warm properly, and your heels ache on the hard floorboards as you are shepherded into the room where family devotions will take place. There is a ritual to this. The governess stands by the hearth with the family Bible on her palms like an offering. Father sits in his chair, shoulders broad and forbidding, a shadow across his mouth. Mother is all glove seams, and glances, smoothing a fold in her skirt as if ironing her conscience, not her clothes. Between them, the line of children looks smaller than usual, the hems of pinafores, the neat partings of hair, the hands clasped because that's what practiced hands do. You kneel on the cold rug because kneeling has always been the posture of repentance and obedience. The brush of the wool bites at your knees. The governess's voice starts to read. It is flat and certain. The words are old friends, passages you know by rote, the catechism's questions and answers like a call-and-response game taught by the church and perfected by your schooling. Who made you? She asks. You answer because the cadence is lodged in your throat. God, short, correct, safe. There is no coaxing here. If anything approaches tenderness, it is a formal thing, a hand placed on a child's shoulder to steady, a mild squeeze when a name is heard in admonishment. Love in this room is measured in duties performed. The Lord's Prayer comes next, every syllable rolled out as if the voice itself might smooth the edges of the day. You mouth it on your knees, breath fogging in quiet puffs beneath the candlelight. The wick sputters, a drop of black soot smudges the white page of the Bible, and the governess presses a handkerchief to her mouth as if offended. Halfway through, a small commotion at the window draws your eye. Young Timothy, no more than 5, has pressed his face to the glass to watch the street lamps. He sneezes, an unladylike, undignified thing, and Mother's hand clamps down on his shoulder. Hands to yourself, she whispers, though the whisper is a public whip. Timothy's lip trembles. He is told to bite it until the quiver passes. You feel a hot prick of sympathy and guilt because sympathy is a sin in this house. It softens you and makes you liable to indulgence. Timothy's cheeks shine with the beginnings of tears that will, if he is lucky, be punished out of him, and if he is unlucky, used as an example the next Sunday. A maid slips in with a candle and trips on the hearthrug, the candle holder clattering. The governess's eyes go narrow as a hawk's. The maid murmurs an apology, cheeks flushing with the kind of shame that cleans out more than dirt. She hurries on, her skirt leaving a damp smear across the floor. The petty chaos settles. The prayers continue, uninterrupted. Order reasserts itself because that is the nursery's God, order over everything. You stand when instructed, standing required after kneeling, a little test of endurance. Father offers a short admonition about temperance and work. He speaks in aphorisms. Idle hands breed weak souls. A man must earn the right to rest. You translate his meaning for yourself. Comfort must be earned, indulgence must be rationed, and stories as amusements fall squarely into the category of indulgence. There will be no fairy tale tonight. There will be no comforting. Voice reading of kingdoms where foolish children are rescued by magic. In this household, the only tales worth telling are the ones that end with moral improvement. At that pronouncement, varnished as advice but carrying the heft of law, you feel the disappointment like a small sting. You had imagined, for a fraction of a second, the warm lap of mother, the rustle of pages, a voice making dragons into metaphor and scraped knees into lessons learned. Tonight, the lap will be empty of storytelling. The page will stay closed. Instead, mother pats your head once briskly, as if tucking you into the ledger of the family ledger rather than into sleep. You are dismissed to your bed without the soft fiction that some other children in less morally fastidious homes get. Nurse hums a nursery hymn, 3 notes repeated until the melody becomes a blockade against imagination, and tucks you into the iron-framed bed. The mattress is bound with horsehair. It squeaks when you shift. Your nightcap smells faintly of lavender, but the blanket smells of starch and the hard, thin way the household presses itself into garments and linens. There are small humiliations in the dark. Across the room, little Maud has hidden a scrap of colored paper. Someone left a cut from a fashion plate. And when the governess discovered it earlier, she made Maud stand in the corner to consider the sinful frivolity of cutting up magazines. Maud stands there now, eyes red, because corners are the room's judgment benches. The older brother, John, has toiled on his arithmetic all day, and having failed one sum, endures a reprimand in private afterwards from father. That incident will not be aired now. Father believes in private correction. You hear the muffled scrape and the low voice, the sound of a ruler being set aside. These little disciplinary events are folded into the night like so many discarded papers. You try to coax sleep, counting the second hand of the hall clock, watching the shadow of the candle crawl like a patient insect across the wall. Your thoughts, when not corralled by catechism or admonition, tumble toward story-shaped voids. A dragon might fit under this bed like a hidden coal, waiting to be stoked. But those are dangerous thoughts. Nurse tucks the blanket tighter and says, without malice, stories make idle habits. You understand that to be idle is to fail not just the household but God. You close your eyes to the scratch of wool against your cheek, to the echo of the prayer's final words, to the residual warmth of the room that will seep out through the panes and into the stairwell. You feel the absence of a story as a physical thing, an empty space on the pillow that could have been filled with made-up voices and impossible adventures. Instead, there is the hush of duty. Instead, there is the steady thud of the house settling, the slow work of beams as they decide where to creak. Outside, a cart passes, wheels on cobbles. Hawker calling once and then gone. Inside, the night is measured in breaths and the small adjustments of people who have learned to make each other conform. You do not resent the discipline as much as you pity it. There is a cruel logic to the evening's finality. Prayers recited, moral lines drawn, stories withheld so character may be built, not entertained. You press your face into the scratchy pillow and think of a grammar of bedtime that leaves no room for dragons, for godmothers, for miraculous reprieves. You think, not for the first time, that the world outside these walls is full of stories that someone is saving up for when they decide the child has earned them. Tonight you have not. So you lie awake, your forehead cold, and imagine, quietly and rebelliously, a single sentence of a tale that will have to wait. You stand in the doorway of the day you just survived and feel the weight of it settle into your shoulders like a heavy wool coat. The clocks in your head chime the hours you lived through. The thin, metallic clink of breakfast spoons against porridge bowls. The steady, indifferent tick of a governess's watch as she marks your posture, your pronunciation, your pulse for any sign of softness. The dull, ceremonial gong of a cane across a palm. You can still taste the grit of coal smoke under your tongue, the stale tang of starch on collars, the iron-bitter tang of the bed frame where you craned your neck to listen for footsteps in the night. Everything about the day is ordered into a single, exhausting sentence. Get up, be useful, be quiet, be correct, endure. Recapping the day feels less like telling a story and more like cataloging wounds. Morning is strict and gray. Porridge is eaten under the stern supervision of a woman whose smile is an exception you are not permitted to notice. You sit at the table and learn to muffle curiosity, because curiosity earns you a look that drills through bone. Lessons begin and the room smells of dust and ink. You practice arithmetic until your fingers go numb, then shift to moral instruction where obedience is read as scripture and feeling is quoted as a fault. Midday brings parlor etiquette. How to hold a teacup so as not to offend, how to lower your eyes when an adult speaks, how to laugh with a control that might pass for amusement but must never become real. There are corporal corrections, of course. This is the day's punctuation. Ear twisting is less theatrical and more domestic, an intimate hollowness that tells you precisely where you fit in the social household. Canings are administered with the same matter-of-fact cadence used for mending a fence or changing a horseshoe. Public humiliation is administered as moral hygiene. A mistake becomes a lesson performed on your shoulders for the education of others. And the nursery, that cold little room with iron bedsteads and scratchy wool, feels like the body's final argument against comfort. You learn to sleep with one eye open and one ear listening for footsteps or the soft, guilty creak of a servant's conscience. Now pull back and hold two images together. The sepia children on the mantel, cheeks rouged by photographers to look innocent and untroubled. The reality you just walked through, raw and unvarnished. That contrast is where myth and truth duel. The popular idea of Victorian childhood is syrupy, a celebration of innocence, of indulgent grandparents and endless domestic safety. It's the photograph in which every child smiles because the long exposure forced them to hold their breath. The truth is grittier and messier. For many, childhood is work. For some, it is sorrow. For others, it is a strict workshop in how to be small in a world that demands you shrink. Myth says Victorians were sentimental to a fault. Reality says they were sentimental only when sentiment could be managed. They loved the idea of childhood as a moral incubator, but they feared the disorder of real emotion. Affection didn't disappear. It was translated into structure, scheduled kindness, rationed praise, and duty disguised as devotion. The wealthy household you inhabited had room for a governess, crisp schedules, and a library of moral tales. The poor child most likely lived in a different story altogether. The factory's roar, the mine's dark mouth, the workhouse's grim efficiency. Both realities feed the myth that every child was carefully cultivated. Instead, the era produced extremes, a tender, performative affection on one hand and a utilitarian, often brutal exigency on the other. You also realize, slowly and a little grudgingly, that the era was not a static abyss. Threads of reform tug at the hem of the day you just stepped out of. Education is becoming more than a privilege in certain circles. There are arguments being made, noisy, messy, sometimes effective, that childhood deserves special consideration. But reforms are slow, like ships turning in fog. What you experienced was the still prevailing logic. Children must be trained, corrected, molded. Love wears gloves and discipline is the language of care. And so the final note of your day is ambivalence. You are glad, with a relief that makes you almost giddy, that you don't have to live strictly according to those rules. You feel gratitude sharp and modern, for the quiet revolution that lets children ask a question and be answered, for classrooms that aim to kindle curiosity rather than extinguish it, for home environments where softness is not automatically read as weakness. You are grateful for child labor laws that untangle childhood from the mills, and for therapists and pediatricians who tell parents it is okay to show warmth, to sit on the floor and cry with a child, rather than mark the moment as failure. But gratitude is complicated. You also hold a clearer, less comfortable understanding of the era's strengths. There is something to the Victorian insistence on order. Where chaos can be destructive, routines can be anchors. The danger is in using order as punishment rather than scaffold. You can recognize the power of ritual without wanting to replicate its cruelty. You notice that some of the day's strictures were attempts, flawed and often harmful, to create predictable, safe patterns in an unpredictable world. That helps you measure modern comforts against their hard-earned predecessors and see both as human attempts to do right, for better and worse. As the room cools and evening light slips from the windows like a thief, you fold these contradictions together. The starched collar becomes a symbol. Suffocating, yes, but also the era's way of saying that children's futures mattered enough to be shaped. The scratchy wool blanket that kept you awake is also a reminder of the material conditions that shaped parenting choices: coal prices, servant availability, the relentless economy of a household. The governess's rigidity reads as cruelty until you imagine her own constraints, her ledger of expectations, her fear of social ruin if her charges faltered. You let the day's humor, dark and a little bitter, sink in, catch yourself smiling at how absurd some rules felt. The era's gravity made for strange customs. You can laugh without trivializing the pain, because humor is how humans survive close quarters with difficulty. But amusement doesn't replace the real relief you now feel. You live in a time when a child's voice can be heard without being punished, when affection doesn't always have to be rationed like coal. So you close the door gently on the day you just walked through. You carry its lessons forward. The need for balance between discipline and kindness. The danger of moral certainty when it silences curiosity. The humility to acknowledge that earlier generations tried to manage hard realities as best they could. You step back into your world with new appreciation for the small liberties you might have taken for granted, the ability to ask, to err, to be held without having to earn it. Outside, the air tastes less of coal and more of the present. Inside, you carry the echo of ticking clocks and the quiet knowledge that history is not a set of sepia postcards, but a living conversation. You are grateful for the gentler answers we now offer children, wary of romanticizing the past, and mindful that progress is never neat. You tuck the day like a folded letter into the drawer of memory, readable, messy, instructive, and settle into a quieter appreciation for the ordinary mercy of our time.